Have you ever found yourself wondering why, despite our best intentions, incredible efforts and undeniable innovation, certain societal problems seem to just stubbornly persist?
hmm
They don't just endure, they often appear to almost reproduce themselves, maybe evolving in form but remaining fundamentally rooted.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
It's a question that feels incredibly relevant today, whether we're talking about access to quality healthcare, equitable education, or, as we're about to explore in depth, the perennial challenge of housing.
Absolutely. Housing is such a persistent one.
So today we're taking a deep dive into a classic, profoundly insightful text, Frederick Engels' The Housing Question.
Ah, yeah, foundational piece.
And this isn't merely about the physical structures, brick and mortar. It's a rigorous, critical examination of how different ideologies approached a fundamental human need over a century ago.
Right. And what their proposed solutions, their failures, and maybe some surprising insights still teach us about the systemic nature of problems that, well, continue to plague modern society.
Exactly.
Our mission today, really, is to unpack Engels' powerful and, let's be honest, often scathing arguments. He meticulously scrutinizes two primary yet contrasting approaches to solving the housing crisis of his time.
Okay.
So on one side, we have the individualistic, sort of justice-driven solutions championed by the Proudhonists, advocating for widespread personal ownership.
Right. That sounds familiar even today.
It does. And then on the other side, you've got the more conventional, philanthropic, and sort of practical measures championed by segments of the bourgeoisie.
Okay. The establishment approach, maybe?
Kind of. And we'll see how Engels dissects their ideas, showing not just what they proposed, but why he believed they were fundamentally flawed, why they couldn't address the root causes. We'll delve into his sharp economic analysis, and yeah, the surprising resonance his critiques still have.
And the sources for this deep dive are truly foundational, right?
Yeah.
We're drawing directly from Engels' own work, The Housing Question, including his insightful preface and its three main parts. And that's where he directly engages with contemporary thinkers like Proudhon's German proponent A. Milberger and the prominent bourgeois economist Dr. Emil Sachs.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches with those guys.
Not at all. So get ready for some surprising facts, perhaps a few aha moments, and maybe a fresh perspective on problems that, despite a century and a half passing, still feel very, very current.
Definitely.
Okay, let's unpack this. When we think about a housing shortage today, our minds often conjure images of, overcrowded apartments, soaring rents, perhaps homelessness.
Sure, the visible stuff.
But Engels, writing back in the 1870s, starts us off by revealing a much darker, almost existential consequence for society at large. He paints a grim picture, one that extends far beyond just the immediate discomfort or economic hardship of the working class.
He really does. He highlights this terrifying interconnectedness of societal problems.
So it's not just about shelter.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
What's truly fascinating here is the almost brutal clarity with which Engels connects the housing crisis directly to public health.
Oh, okay.
He makes this compelling, frankly undeniable case that poor living conditions weren't just a humanitarian issue or, a matter of social inequality. They were a literal, tangible threat to everyone, regardless of their social standing or wealth.
How so?
Well, he highlights that the so-called poor districts, where workers were crowded together in incredibly dense, unsanitary conditions, they weren't just uncomfortable or undignified. They were, as he's darkly put it, breeding places of all those epidemics which from time to time afflict our towns.
Wow. Breeding places.
Exactly. He's speaking of a very real and immediate danger that couldn't just be walled off or ignored by the upper classes.
And he names specific diseases.
Oh, yeah. He specifically calls out things like cholera, typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox. And these were the scourges of the 19th century that could wipe out huge numbers of people.
Terrifying.
And these ravaging diseases, he explains, spread their germs in the pestilential air and the poisoned water found in these working-class quarters. You have to imagine the stench, the raw sewage, the lack of clean drinking water in these overcrowded tenements and cellars.
It paints a grim picture.
It does. And here's the absolutely crucial point that, according to Engels, finally spurred some action, albeit maybe for the wrong reasons. These germs, he says, hardly ever die out completely. And as soon as circumstances permit it, they develop into epidemics and then spread beyond their breeding places, also into the more airy and healthy parts of the town inhabited by the capitalists.
Ah, so it didn't stay contained.
Exactly. It crossed class lines. Which raises that important question. Why did this finally push the philanthropic bourgeois into action? It wasn't purely altruism, according to Engels.
Right.
It was, as he notes with his characteristic cynicism, a matter of stark self-preservation. He quotes a common observation from the time. The angel of death rages in its ranks as ruthlessly as in the ranks of the workers.
So when the wealthy started getting sick too,
Suddenly, the housing question shifted, didn't it? It went from being a problem of the workers to a problem for society as a whole, including its most powerful members. That self-interest, Engels argues, became the unexpected catalyst for those initial, maybe tentative, efforts at reform.
okay, so if I'm understanding this, Engels is arguing that the immediate motivation for the bourgeoisie to even look at the housing issue was less about inherent morality and more about a very practical concern for their own survival.
That's certainly how he frames it, a powerful motivator.
But beyond that immediate health crisis, he argues that the housing shortage itself is a symptom, right? A symptom of something far deeper within the prevailing economic system. Can you elaborate on how he connects those dots?
Absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Engels insists the housing shortage is a necessary product of the bourgeois social order.
Necessary, not just an unfortunate byproduct.
Necessary. He's unequivocal. It's not an accident or a simple oversight or even just a failure of good intentions. For him, it's an inherent, unavoidable outcome of the capitalist system itself.
Okay, why? What are the mechanics there?
Well, he details several foundational reasons. First, the fact that the great masses of the workers are exclusively dependent upon wages. And critically, these wages are generally only enough to cover the sum of foodstuffs necessary for their existence and for the propagation of their kind.
Bare subsistence, basically.
Pretty much. Which means they have little to no disposable income for anything beyond that, let alone for decent, safe, or spacious housing.
Right.
Secondly, there's the constant looming threat he calls technological unemployment. As machinery improves, as production gets more efficient, it continually throws masses of workers out of employment.
Creating competition for jobs.
Exactly. It creates what he famously terms a large reserve army of unemployed workers. These displaced workers flood the labor market, pushing wages down, and at the same time, they add to the fierce competition for the cheapest, most rundown housing, making conditions even worse for everyone at the bottom.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Thirdly, the regular and violent industrial vacillations. Think the boom and bust cycles, the economic crises, the downturns that are just part of capitalism.
Yeah, those haven't gone away.
Not at all. These cycles, he says, determine, on the one hand, the existence of a large reserve army of unemployed workers, and on the other hand, drive large masses of the workers temporarily unemployed onto the streets. This inherent instability means workers can't plan for the long term. Stable housing becomes precarious.
Okay.
Fourthly, and this was especially visible in the 19th century with rapid industrialization, workers are crowded together in masses in the big towns at a quicker rate than dwellings come into existence for them under existing conditions.
Urbanization outpacing housing supply.
Massively. The sheer speed of it meant supply just couldn't keep pace with the flood of people seeking work. And this intense, unchecked demand creates a market even for what he calls the most infamous pigsties.
Because people have no other choice.
Exactly. Landlords can charge outrageous rents for utterly squalid conditions because, well, where else are people going to go?
And the landlords themselves.
And finally, yes, the house owner, in his capacity as capitalist, has not only the right, but in view of the competition, to a certain extent also the duty of ruthlessly making as much out of his property in house rent as he possibly can.
A duty.
Well, from a capitalist perspective, they're operating under the same competitive pressures as any other capitalist. Maximize profit from your asset, in this case, housing often, Engels argues, at the expense of human dignity.
Summing all that up.
His conclusion is stark. It's uncompromising. The housing shortage can only be abolished if the whole social order from which it springs is fundamentally refashioned.
Wow. So it's not just about building more houses.
Not for Engels. It's about a complete societal overhaul, a revolution in how society organizes itself economically and socially.
This immediately sets the stage for a fundamental conflict, doesn't it? A core question that still resonates today. Are we looking for a Band-Aid, a surface-level fix, or are we actually trying to tackle the systemic problem?
And Engels clearly lands on the systemic side, no question.
Okay, so with that framework in mind, let's dive into the first proposed solution that Engels accepts. It's one that sounds quite radical, maybe even appealing at first glance, but according to him, it completely misses the mark.
Yeah, this is where he takes on Proudhon, or actually Proudhon's German follower, A. Milberger.
Right. And their core idea seems, well, pretty interesting. Turn tenants into owners. Have their rent payments count towards the purchase price of their home?
Rent to own, basically.
Which sounds like a straightforward pathway to property for the working class, right? Like it could liberate them from the clutches of landlords, offer stability, independence.
Indeed, it's a notion that definitely resonates, even now. This idea of empowering individuals through ownership, dismantling what looks like a fundamentally unfair system. Milberger's central idea, as Engels quotes him, is that as the wage worker in relation to the capitalist, so is the tenant in relation to the house owner.
Okay, so he's drawing a direct parallel there. Exploitation in both cases.
That's the implication. He suggests an inherent exploitation in both relationships, basically equating the rent payment to a form of surplus value extraction, similar to how a capitalist exploits a worker's labor. He sees both as a kind of legal title to income derived from someone else's labor or need.
But Engels disagrees.
Immediately, sharply. His counter is, this is totally untrue.
Why?
He argues that the tenant-landlord relationship is fundamentally a simple commodity sale of use value. You're paying for the temporary use of a dwelling, just like you'd buy any other commodity off the shelf.
So it's a transaction, not exploitation in the same sense.
Not in the same sense as the labor-capital relationship.
Yeah.
He stresses that it's not an exploitation that produces surplus value. No new value is created in the rent transaction itself. It's just a transfer of existing value. The worker, when they act as a tenant, is simply a buyer with money.
Okay.
The peculiar results which attend the sale of labor power to the capitalist, primarily the production of surplus value, that extra value a worker creates beyond their wages, which the capitalist keeps. It's completely absent here.
That's a critical distinction for him then.
Absolutely critical. He's saying the Proudhonists fundamentally misdiagnose the economic nature of rent. They see a kind of theft, where Engels sees a commercial transaction, albeit one happening within a broader exploitative system, but the transaction itself is different.
Okay, so it sounds like Engels is saying they misunderstand the basic economic mechanism of rent. What then is the fundamental flaw in this rent-to-own idea, beyond just mischaracterizing the economic relationship? There seems to be a deeper issue with how capital and value work.
Precisely. Milberger complains that a house becomes this perpetual legal title to income, right? Even after its real value, the cost of building it has been paid back 2, 3, 5, 10, and more times over in its rent yield.
Yeah, that sounds unfair on the surface.
It does. He sees this as an inherent injustice, a continuous unfair extraction from the tenant long after the initial investment is recouped. But Engels then provides this detailed economic dissection of what rent actually comprises. He wants to show it's way more complex than just simple interest on building costs.
Okay, break that down for us. What's included in rent, according to Engels?
Well, he explains that rent has to cover several things. First, and this is crucial, ground rent. That's the interest on the increasing value of the land itself.
Land the owner didn't necessarily improve.
Exactly. The value arises from societal development, population growth, urban expansion, not usually from the landowner's direct effort. Second, rent has to cover repairs and bad debts, ongoing maintenance, plus lost income from empty properties or tenants who can't pay.
Standard business costs, really.
Right. And third, it includes amortization. That's the process of paying off the building capital itself over time, because houses are perishable. They deteriorate, they eventually become worthless.
Okay, so it's not just profit on the building cost.
No. And Engels highlights that the phenomenon Milberger complains about high rent increases, covering initial costs many times over, is solely due to an increase of ground rent in rapidly growing cities. It's not some inherent legal injustice tied to the building itself.
It's the land value speculation.
Primarily, yes. In fact, Engels notes that most rents, apart from those ground rent increases, only yield about a 7% return on the invested capital, including profit, which in that era wasn't seen as exorbitant for capital investment.
So the perceived injustice isn't really in the house itself, but in the rising value of urban land and how that gets captured.
That's a big part of his argument. The focus on the house payment is misplaced.
It sounds like Proudhon and Milberger are focusing on the legal form of the transaction, the rent payment, rather than the underlying economic substance of land value and capital return.
You've hit on a crucial distinction for Engels. He says Proudhon, when faced with these economic realities, rescues himself by a bold leap from economics into legal talk, appealing to this abstract notion of eternal justice.
Like a moral argument instead of an economic one.
Exactly. And Engels argues that this abstract conception of justice means nothing if it doesn't align with the underlying economic laws and realities. It's a pious wish, a moral sermon, rather than a scientific analysis based on material conditions.
He has a colorful analogy for this, doesn't he?
He does. He warns that this approach is like believing if toads had tails, they would no longer be toads. It's a presumptuous demand, he says, rather than a description or explanation of how the economy actually works.
So justice itself isn't the driver.
For Engels, justice isn't some abstract ideal floating above society. It's a reflection of the existing economic relations. The justice of the bourgeoisie, for instance, includes its own right to exploit the workers. So simply calling for eternal justice without fundamentally changing the economic base is, in his view, ultimately toothless. It doesn't change the material reality.
Okay, that's a powerful critique of the theoretical basis, but this raises an important practical question. What about the workers themselves? Even if the economic theory behind it is flawed, isn't there something genuinely appealing about widespread home ownership for the working class? Doesn't it offer stability, a stake in society?
Oh, absolutely. The Proudhonist vision of every worker owning their own little home sounds idyllic on paper, and it definitely holds a powerful emotional appeal even today. But Engels points out what he sees as its deeply reactionary basic outlook when applied to industrial workers within the existing capitalist system.
Reactionary? How so?
Well, for urban industrial workers, he argues, freedom of movement is the first condition of their existence. They need to be able to move to where the jobs are, to adapt to the fluctuating demands of industry.
Chasing work, essentially.
Right. And homeownership, in this context, would actually be a hindrance to them. It would effectively be chaining them once again to the soil, or maybe to a specific factory town.
Limiting their options.
Severely. It would limit their ability to seek better wages or different employment opportunities elsewhere, makes them less adaptable, more immobile, and therefore potentially more vulnerable to exploitation by local employers.
Okay, I see the mobility argument. What else?
Furthermore, think about the inherent instability of capitalism that we talked about. During a big strike or a general industrial crisis, events, Engels saw as inevitable parts of the cycle what happens.
People lose their jobs, income dries up.
Exactly. And if all the workers in an affected industrial area own their homes, those houses would suddenly flood the market. There'd be a glut. This would mean they'd either find no buyers at all, or they'd be forced to sell at far below their cost price.
Turning their asset into a liability just when they need cash most.
Precisely. It would worsen their financial distress precisely when they're most vulnerable. He illustrates this quite vividly with the example of French and Rhineland peasants whose houses and fields are loaded down with mortgages, making their harvests belong effectively to their creditors. This, he states with biting irony, is economic independence for the usurer.
So the worker becomes tied not just to a place, but to a debt.
A potentially crushing debt. It creates a new, perhaps even more insidious form of dependence rather than liberation.
And there's another crucial economic insight you mentioned earlier about wages.
Yes, and this is a point Engels hammers home repeatedly. Any general savings reform that appears to lower a worker's cost of living, like making housing cheaper through ownership, would ultimately just lead to a corresponding reduction of wages.
Why would wages go down?
Because, in his analysis, wages tend towards the cost of reproducing labor power. If a major component of that cost, like housing, becomes cheaper across the board, capitalists can justify paying lower wages because the workers' basic needs can now be met for less money.
So the saving doesn't actually benefit the worker in the end?
Not in the long run, according to Engels. He argues the worker saves, therefore, not in his own interests, but in the interests of the capitalist, who benefits from lower wage bills because the cost of keeping the worker alive and able to work has decreased.
Wow. So what looks like a benefit for the worker actually just accrues to the capitalist's profit margin, reinforcing the system.
That's his argument. It ends up subsidizing capitalism rather than challenging it.
So summarizing the critique of Proudhon, it's not just impractical, but potentially counterproductive for workers. It creates new vulnerabilities, chains them down, and ultimately might just lower their wages.
Pretty much, yeah.
And then there's this deeper, almost cynical motive. Engels uncovers for why some bourgeois elements might actually support worker homeownership, even if they don't buy into Proudhon's justice arguments. It seems less about uplift and more about social control.
Yes, this is a truly revealing point. It shows how seemingly benevolent ideas can serve underlying political and economic interests. Herr Sachs, the bourgeois economist we'll discuss more soon, explicitly states, and Engels flags this, that not only the working class but society as a whole has the greatest interest in seeing as many of its members as possible bound to the land.
That exclamation mark from Engels says a lot, bound.
It really does. It emphasizes Engels' interpretation of the true, perhaps coercive intent behind the philanthropic language. The hope, as Sachs himself articulates it, is that by becoming property owners, workers would also lose their proletarian character and become, once again, obedient toadies like their forefathers.
Making them conservative, less likely to cause trouble.
Exactly. It's seen as a method to stifle all revolutionary spirit and essentially create an army for themselves against the proletariat. Engels points to real-world examples, like a certain M. Dollfuss in France, who apparently used worker homeownership schemes not just for profit, but with a clear political objective, to quell worker unrest and integrate them more firmly into the existing social order.
So from this perspective, homeownership isn't liberation at all. It's a form of social pacification.
A way to integrate the working class into the status quo, turning potential revolutionaries into, well, quiescent property holders worried about their mortgage payments.
It's a fascinating insight into how seemingly positive ideas can have these underlying motives that actually benefit the status quo, turning workers into a conservative force. Okay, so if Proudhon's solution is a non-starter for Engels misdiagnosing the problem, potentially counterproductive, what about the more conventional philanthropic approaches, the ones championed by the bourgeoisie themselves? Surely their direct efforts to improve conditions must have had some impact on the ground.
Well, that's the next big area Engels tackles, moving from those abstract notions of eternal justice to the more concrete, though he argues limited, efforts.
Right. He scrutinizes how the big bourgeoisie, spurred on by those epidemics we discussed earlier, actually attempted to solve the housing question, often through these large-scale philanthropic initiatives.
That's right. As we touched upon, once science definitively proved that chilling link between poor housing and epidemic spread.
Self-preservation kicked in.
Exactly. Engels notes that philanthropic bourgeois began to compete with one another in noble efforts. This sudden burst of concern led to a whole flurry of activity. Societies were founded, countless books were written, various proposals drafted, even laws debated and passed, all supposedly in order to close the sources of the ever-recurring epidemics.
And this was especially happening in England.
Particularly in England, yes. It had the greatest number of large industrial towns, and crucially, the bourgeoisie there felt most immediately threatened by diseases spreading from working-class areas into their own neighborhoods.
Did Engels acknowledge any value in these efforts?
He does note specific English efforts, like the appointment of numerous government commissions to investigate the hygienic conditions of the working classes. And he actually concedes their reports were honorably distinguished from all continental sources by their accuracy, completeness, and impartiality.
So they provided good data.
Excellent data, apparently. A truly detailed picture of the grim realities. These reports, he admits, provided the basis for new, more or less radically effective laws. He even says these English laws were infinitely ahead of everything that has been done in this direction up to the present on the continent.
But there's always a but with Engels here.
There is, and it's the crucial pivot. He immediately follows this acknowledgement by stating that despite all these efforts, even in England, the remedying of them has hardly advanced a single step.
Why not? If the laws were good and the data was clear.
Because, he concludes, the inherent capitalist order of society reproduces again and again the evils which are to be remedied with such inevitable necessity. The system itself is the problem. It constantly regenerates the very conditions, poverty, exploitation, overcrowding, that create the housing crisis in the first place. The fixes are temporary, superficial.
So even with sincere intentions and detailed reports, Engels argues the problem stubbornly persists because the root cause isn't touched.
Precisely. And he then turns his attention to a key bourgeois proponent, this Dr. Emil Sachs, and his book from 1869, which tried to summarize all this philanthropic literature and propose solutions.
And Engels is skeptical.
Deeply skeptical. He holds up Sachs's book, The Housing Conditions of the Working Classes and Their Reform, as a prime example of bourgeois literature on public health and the housing question that often relied more on fine-sounding and solemn phrases than on rigorous analysis or real engagement with the facts.
Harsh critique.
Very. Engels is quite scathing about Sachs's scholarship and sources, calling them banal, bourgeois, well-meaning Philistine, and hypocritical philanthropic writings. He points out that of the real main sources, those meticulous English parliamentary reports, Sachs only mentions 3 of the oldest by name, and Engels asserts the whole book proves that its author has never glanced at even a single one of them.
So he's accusing him of basically faking his research.
Or at least relying on secondary, less reliable sources, perhaps like a certain Julius Faucher, whom Engels dismisses with biting sarcasm. This immediately undercuts the credibility of Sachs's supposedly practical solutions in Engels' eyes.
Okay, so the sourcing is weak. Does that lead to a flawed philosophy?
It certainly contributes. This critique of sources leads to a deeper, more fundamental criticism of Sachs's core economic philosophy. Sachs declares, with what Engels clearly perceives as naive grandiosity, that by social economy we mean political economy in its application to social questions. Okay, so far.
Right.
Or, to put it more precisely, the totality of the ways and means which this science offers us for raising the so-called propertyless classes to the level of the property classes on the basis of its iron laws within the framework of the order of society at present prevailing.
Wait. Raise the property list to the level of the property within the current system and its iron laws. How does that work?
Exactly. Engels immediately seizes on the inherent contradiction. How can you have a capitalist system which fundamentally requires a propertyless class, those who only have their labor power to sell, and yet simultaneously wish to raise this entire class to the level of the property classes without fundamentally altering the iron laws of capitalism that create and sustain that very distinction in the first place?
It sounds logically impossible.
That's Engels' point. He sarcastically asks, perhaps Sachs would be so good as to show us how all the soldiers of the French army can be turned into field marshals without at the same time ceasing to be private soldiers. It's a wish to abolish the consequences of capitalism, like a large propertyless class, while maintaining capitalism itself. An impossible feat, in Engels' view.
So, according to Engels, their fundamental premise is flawed from the start. They're trying to achieve something economically contradictory within the framework they insist on preserving.
Yes, that's the core of his critique of Sachs's whole approach.
But, okay, what about the practical solutions that come out of this flawed philosophy? How do those specific proposals fare under Engels' scrutiny?
Predictably, not well. Sachs, just like Proudhon, ultimately advocates for homeownership as the complete solution to the housing question. He states it can be completely solved only by transferring property and dwellings to the hands of the workers.
Same solution, different rationale maybe.
Seems like it. And Sachs, as Engels puts it, gets into poetic raptures about the idea, describing how it leads workers to the pure heights of material and spiritual well-being. The sentiment might sound noble, but the economic analysis underpinning it is, for Engels, profoundly lacking, just as it was with Proudhon.
So Engels just repeats his earlier arguments.
Pretty much, yeah. His rejoinder is swift and firm, reiterating those consistent economic counterarguments. He again emphasizes that workers need mobility, that homeownership is a hindrance, especially during strikes or crises when they might be forced to sell at a loss.
The chains argument again.
Right. And crucially, he repeats the point that any general savings reform or reduction in the cost of living for workers, like through cheaper housing via ownership, would inevitably lead to a corresponding reduction of wages.
The wage suppression argument.
Exactly. That core paradox again. Such measures don't truly benefit the worker in the long run, but rather the capitalist, by creating, as Sachs himself hopes, a diligent, skilled, willing, contented, and devoted working class whose cost of reproduction is lower.
So it's a good investment for capitalists because it helps stabilize their labor force and lowers their wage bill.
That's how Engels sees it, not as a genuine liberation for workers.
This leads us then to the distinction between different actual housing systems and the realities of urban development. It seems that even the most practical of these bourgeois solutions run smack bang into unyielding economic forces, especially in those rapidly growing cities.
Indeed. Sachs discusses the cottage system, individual houses with gardens, common in England at the time, versus the barrack system. These large buildings with many dwellings packed in, which were becoming common in Paris and Vienna.
And the cottage system sounds nicer.
It's presented as the ideal for worker ownership, right? Promising fresh air, green space, individual control. But even Sachs himself is forced to admit that it's, quote, not realizable just in the centers of the housing shortage in the big cities on account of the high price of land.
Ah, the land cost problem again.
Exactly. It kills the dream. This highlights, for Engels, that the bourgeois solution has come to grief owing to the antithesis of town and country. The immense, ever-increasing value of land in urban centers simply makes widespread individual homeownership impossible for the working class.
So what's left?
All that's left for them, Sachs essentially concedes, is to try and make the barracks, the tenements, as tolerable as possible. Which is a far, far cry from that utopian vision of universal homeownership in idyllic cottages. It shows the practical limit of their vision within the capitalist framework.
And this brings us to a particularly striking and, well, cynical solution that Engels analyzes, which he calls houseman. It sounds like a powerful metaphor for a certain kind of urban development.
It really is. Haussmann. Named after Baron Haussmann, the powerful prefect of Paris under Napoleon III, who radically rebuilt the city.
Mm.
It refers to the practice of breaking long, straight, and broad streets through the closely built workers' quarters and erecting big, luxurious buildings on both sides.
Gentrification avant la lettre, almost.
In a way, yes, but with added layers. Ostensibly, the stated motives for Haussmann's massive urban redesign were things like public health, beautifying the city, improving traffic flow, legitimate concerns, perhaps.
But Engels sees other motives.
Deeper, more cynical motives. Beyond the obvious strategic aim of making barricade fighting more difficult, those wide avenues were great for cavalry charges and artillery lines of sight.
Right, military control.
Yes. But the intention was also, Engels argues, to develop a specifically Bonapartist, building trades proletariat dependent on the government, and to turn the city into a pure luxury city. It was partly an economic stimulus package tied to political control, catering explicitly to the wealthy and the state's power.
And what was the result for the housing question itself?
The consistent result, according to Engels, regardless of the stated reasons, is always the same. The scandalous alleys and lanes disappear.
Sounds good so far.
But they appear again immediately somewhere else, and often in the immediate neighborhood.
Displacement.
Exactly. This is, as Engels bluntly states, a striking example of how the bourgeoisie solves the housing question in practice, by merely shifting the problem, not abolishing it. The underlying economic necessity which produced them in the first place produces them in the next place also.
The demand for cheap labor doesn't go away.
Precisely. It draws workers to the cities, and if their old, cheap dwellings are destroyed, new, equally squalid ones inevitably spring up elsewhere, maybe further out, maybe packed even tighter.
Does he give examples?
He gives a specific London example from his time. Recent acts of Parliament authorizing new street construction where thousands of workers are simply turned out of their homes. Yes, some new buildings go up, big 5- or 6-story tenement barracks, but he estimates hardly more than a quarter of the workers actually evicted are rehoused in them, often at higher rents.
So the problem isn't solved, it's just exported, maybe made less visible to the wealthy areas?
Exactly. It highlights the system's inherent inability, in his view, to address the root causes of urban poverty and the housing shortage. It's just a permanent shell game.
Okay, so whether through grand theoretical schemes like Proudhon's or Haussmann-esque urban renewal, Engels argues the capitalists won't, or perhaps can't, truly solve it within their system. What about workers' own self-help initiatives, like building societies? These sound like they could empower workers directly, maybe outside of capitalist control, a grassroots solution.
Well, Herr Sachs, in his bourgeois treatise, is actually an enthusiastic worshiper of self-help. He believes in the power of individual initiative, communal effort.
Sounds promising.
But even he, the proponent, is compelled to admit that it's really only effective in rural areas, or maybe for the better situated workers.
Yeah.
Those who already have some financial stability.
Not for the poorest in the cities where the problem is worst.
Exactly. In big cities where the housing shortage is most acute and the need most desperate, Sachs reluctantly concedes self-help is very limited. He kind of sighs that reform in this way, by self-help, can be effected only in a roundabout way and must therefore always be imperfect. That admission from a strong advocate kind of highlights the inherent limitations, doesn't it?
It does. So what's Engels' take on these building societies?
Well, Engels then clarifies the often misunderstood reality of the English building societies of his time, which were frequently held up as models of worker self-empowerment. He states unequivocally they are not workers' societies, nor is it their main aim to provide workers with their own houses.
Really, what are they then?
He says, on the contrary, we shall see that this happens only very exceptionally. These societies, he reveals, are essentially of a speculative nature. They were often founded by the petty bourgeoisie, small shopkeepers, clerks, master artisans, not primarily by industrial workers seeking homes.
So more like investment clubs.
Pretty much. Their main aim was to provide more profitable mortgage investment at a good rate of interest, and they were deeply intertwined with speculation in real estate. They are, in essence, financial enterprises looking for returns, not housing charities.
Does he give an example of how this works?
He gives a really fascinating example from London that illustrates the underlying dynamic. In London, as he explains, almost all the land belongs to maybe a dozen powerful aristocratic families who typically lease it out for long terms, like 99 years.
Okay.
Building societies then become, he says, an important intermediate link in a system that ensures the continual renewal of houses, but at the leaseholder's expense. The aristocratic landowners put repairing clauses into their leases, meaning the tenant, the leaseholder, is forced to demolish the old house near the end of the lease and build a new one at their own expense, or face penalties. If they don't, the land and whatever's left on it reverts to the landowner.
So the leaseholder has to rebuild the property for the landowner.
Essentially, yes, to maintain their lease or realize any value from it. And where do they get the money? They borrow it from the building societies. These loans fund the repairs or new constructions required by the landowners, securing the value of the aristocratic property without any effort or investment from the landowners themselves.
Wow.
Engels concludes this description with sharp sarcasm. And this is supposed to be a solution of the housing question for the workers.
So it's another instance where a seemingly beneficial self-help solution actually ends up propping up the existing property relations and benefiting the already wealthy landowners, not the workers.
Exactly. It becomes a tool for financial extraction and maintaining the existing power structure, rather than genuinely addressing the needs of the working class.
Okay, self-help doesn't cut it either, according to Engels. So finally, what about direct state assistance? Surely that, with the state's immense power and resources, could make a significant difference. Step in where private initiatives and self-help fail. This sounds like the most logical path for a truly large-scale solution.
Well, Sachs proposes three main roles for the state in his book.
Okay, what are they?
First, he says, the state must take care that in its legislation and administration, all those things which in any way result in accentuating the housing shortage among the working classes are abolished or appropriately remedied.
So fix bad laws. Make building easier.
Sort of. This would mean revising building legislation, maybe allowing more freedom for building trades to make construction cheaper, theoretically increasing supply. But Engels immediately counters. He points out that in England, building legislation was already minimal, trades were largely free, yet the shortage persisted.
So deregulation wasn't the answer.
Not only that, Engels argues, but the lack of regulation meant building was so cheaply carried out that the houses totter when a cart goes by, and every day some of them collapse.
Good grief.
He gives that chilling anecdote. Just the day before he wrote this section, 6 houses collapsed simultaneously in Manchester, seriously injuring 6 workers. A direct consequence, he implies, of inadequate, cheap, unregulated construction.
So this legislative approach offers no real remedy, might even make things worse.
Okay, not encouraging. What's the second role for the state?
Second, Sachs suggests that the state power must prevent individuals in their narrow-minded individualism from reproducing the evil or causing it anew.
Meaning state inspection.
Enforcement.
Yeah, basically state inspection and the power to close down dilapidated, unsafe houses.
This had supposedly been the case in England since 1857 with something called the Nuisances Removal Act.
But did it work? Engels points out that these English laws, like the Nuisances Removal Act of 1855, the Local Government Act of 1858, largely remained a dead letter. They were barely enforced, maybe due to lack of political will, maybe lack of resources, maybe lobbying from property owners.
So the laws existed but weren't used.
Largely ineffective.
Yeah.
And even a later law, the Artisans' Dwellings Act, which seemed progressive on paper, was administered by local urban authorities who, Engels claims, were notorious for corruption of all kinds, nepotism and jobbery.
Jobbery. What's that?
Engels defines it explicitly: the exploitation of a public office to the private advantage of the official or his family. He even gives a concrete example: a telegraph director secretly owning a paper factory and then giving his factory all the lucrative government orders for telegraph paper.
Ah, insider dealing, corruption.
Exactly. It shows how state power, when operating within the existing capitalist framework, can be easily subverted to serve private interests rather than the public good. Even well-intentioned laws can become tools for illicit gain or simply ignored if they conflict with powerful interests.
Okay, so regulation and enforcement are also problematic. What's the third state role Sachs proposes?
Thirdly, Sachs argues the state must make use of all the positive means at its disposal to remedy the existing housing shortage to the most comprehensive extent.
Meaning the state should actually build houses or fund them.
Yes, things like building model buildings. Though Engels quickly notes these were typically built for state officials, not workers, and granting loans to municipalities or societies for housing projects.
Did that happen? Was it effective?
Engels cites the English Public Works Loan Act, It provided a maximum sum of £50,000 sterling for this purpose across the whole country. Enough, he calculates, to build at the utmost 400 cottages.
400 cottages for the whole country.
Yes. Engels calls it, quite rightly, a drop in the ocean, a negligible sum compared to the massive scale of the problem. Even if this fund were doubled after 20 years, as it apparently was, it was still utterly insignificant compared to the need.
Barely scratching the surface.
Not even that. Given that cottages then had an average life of maybe 40 years, this fund would barely cover replacing the oldest, most dilapidated units each year, let alone address any new demand or population growth.
So state funding was totally inadequate.
Woefully inadequate. And Engels adds a pointed critique specifically aimed at the Prussian state, his contemporary German context. He notes that a state where non-bourgeois elements are becoming more bourgeois every day, and where the bourgeoisie itself is too cowardly to press its own demands energetically, is inherently unlikely to genuinely solve the social question.
Why? Because the state serves those bourgeois interests?
Or is increasingly influenced by them, yes. He dismisses Bismarck's attempts to organize a kind of bodyguard proletariat through minimal state assistance, maybe some early social insurance schemes, as merely another Bonapartist destiny, just offering benevolent phrases to the workers while fundamentally maintaining the capitalist status quo.
So it seems Engels systematically tears down every proposed solution he examines, whether from the Proudhonists or the bourgeoisie. He finds them all either misguided, self-serving, or just woefully inadequate.
That's right. They all fail, in his analysis, to grasp or address the systemic nature of the problem. They're treating symptoms, often ineffectively, rather than the underlying disease.
Okay, so if all these practical or justice-driven solutions fall short, consistently failing to address the problem at its roots, what then does Engels say is the real path forward? How can the housing question actually be solved, according to him? It sounds like he believes a truly transformative change is necessary, not just reforms.
You're absolutely right. His conclusion is radical and systemic. Engels asserts quite plainly that the solution lies in the abolition of the capitalist mode of production and the appropriation of all the means of life and labor by the working class itself.
Wow, so full-scale revolution is the only answer.
That's the ultimate answer, yes. He emphasizes again and again that the housing shortage is merely a symptom, a manifestation of that deeper systemic issue, not the primary disease itself. It's folly, in his view, to hope for a standalone, isolated solution for housing or, frankly, any other major social problem affecting workers.
Because it's all connected.
It's all connected. He directly challenges the idea of isolated solutions, stating quite clearly, as long as the capitalist mode of production continues to exist, it is folly to hope for an isolated solution of the housing question, or of any other social question affecting the fate of the workers. For him, it's all interwoven, a complex web of problems stemming from the fundamental way society organizes itself around capital and private property.
That raises a really important question, though. Does that mean we just wait for this grand revolution to happen? Or are there immediate steps that can be taken even before the complete overhaul of the economic system? It sounds a bit like an all-or-nothing proposition, but is there a practical interim stage in his thinking?
That's a fair question. And no, he's not actually advocating for just sitting back and waiting for some distant utopian future. He's surprisingly pragmatic about immediate measures, especially in the context of a revolutionary transition.
Okay, like what?
He acknowledges that each social revolution will have to take things as it finds them. You can't just wish away the existing housing stock or the immediate needs of the population. So an immediate remedy, he suggests, would involve expropriating a part of the luxury dwellings belonging to the property classes and by quartering workers in the remaining part.
Requisitioning housing, basically.
Essentially, yes. He views this not as some far-fetched utopian ideal, but as a practical measure dictated in the public interests. And he notes, it would be just as easy to carry out as other expropriations and billotings are by the existing state. Think wartime measures once the proletariat has gained political power.
So while the ultimate solution is systemic change, he does identify immediate practical steps a revolutionary government could, and probably should, take to alleviate the most acute suffering and begin the transformation process.
Exactly. It's a blend of that long-term vision, abolishing capitalism, and addressing immediate pressing necessities using the power available during a transition.
Okay. And what about the bigger picture stuff, like that deeply entrenched divide between town and country? That seems like a monumental challenge, but Engels suggests it's crucial for solving not just housing but other social problems too.
Yes, this is indeed a crucial point for Engels, and it really demonstrates his holistic understanding. He sees societal problems stretching beyond just economic structures to encompass geographical and even ecological imbalances.
How does the town-country split relate to housing?
He argues that the housing question can only be truly and permanently solved when society undergoes transformations that abolish the antithesis of town and country, which he believed had been brought to an extreme point by present-day capitalist society.
Meaning the huge concentration of people and industry in cities, leaving the countryside depleted.
Precisely that imbalance. And he actually credits early utopian socialists, people like Robert Owen and Charles Fourier, for recognizing this fundamental problem much earlier. Their model plans, Owen's Villages of Unity and Cooperation, or Fourier's Phalanstères, explicitly aim to eliminate this antithesis, moving towards a more integrated, balanced distribution of population and production across the landscape.
So less concentration, more distribution.
Right. And he illustrates the absurdity and sheer wastefulness of maintaining the sharp divide using insights from the agricultural chemist Liebig. Liebig had shown how incredibly valuable manure produced in cities rich in essential nutrients for farming was simply being wasted, often dumped into rivers and the sea.
Instead of being returned to the land.
Exactly. Returned to the land to enrich the soil and sustain food production. Engels mentions Berlin, for example, literally wallowing in its own filth for at least 30 years because of this massive failure to rationally connect urban waste with rural needs. It's an ecological disaster driven by the economic separation.
So the argument is,
He contends, with real conviction, that to want to solve the housing question while at the same time desiring to maintain the modern big cities is an absurdity.
why an absurdity?
Because the logic is clear. These sprawling, congested cities create the housing crisis through overcrowding and high land values. They create the health crises through unsanitary conditions. They create environmental waste. And that very congestion and scale is directly linked to the capitalist mode of production's need for centralized labor and markets.
So abolishing the capitalist city is key.
Abolishing the modern big city as it exists as a center of exploitation, speculation, and waste. This, he argues, depends entirely on the abolition of the capitalist mode of production itself. Only then could society achieve a more rational, decentralized, healthier, and environmentally conscious distribution of population and industry, bridging that town-country divide.
So it's almost a dialectical process you're describing. The Industrial Revolution, which caused so many of these the overcrowding, the pollution, the exploitation, also, in Engels' view, holds the key to their solution.
Precisely. That's a very good way to put it. Engels sees modern large-scale industry not just as the source of these problems, but as having created the sole conditions under which the exploitation of the working class can be overthrown.
How so? What did industry create that enables this?
Well, first, he argues it has profoundly liberated workers from all traditional fetters, including those that tied them semi-feudally to the land, like the old hand weavers who might have had a little house and garden but were dependent on merchants. Industry drew them together, creating a distinct proletariat.
Okay. Freed from old bonds, maybe.
And second, crucially, the immense increase in the productivity of labor that came with industry, he mentions. A 1,000-fold increase creates, for the very first time in history, the unprecedented possibility of producing enough for the plentiful consumption of all members of society and for an abundant reserve fund.
Enough for everyone, basically.
Enough for everyone to live well, yes. And beyond just mere subsistence, this potential abundance also enables sufficient leisure for everyone. Leisure time for cultural development, for science, for art, for human relationships, things previously only available to a tiny elite.
And what does this new material possibility mean for social structures?
It means, according to Engels, that the excuse disappears for the existence of a ruling class. Historically, ruling classes could justify their existence by claiming they managed intellectual work, organized society, oversaw production. But with modern industry creating this potential abundance and requiring complex coordination, that historical justification becomes obsolete.
So the ruling class becomes redundant.
Worse than redundant. In his view, the continued existence of a ruling class, like the bourgeoisie, actually becomes a hindrance to the development of industrial productive power, and equally so to science, art, and especially cultural human relations. Their interests profit, control actively obstruct progress, and stifle broader human flourishing rather than facilitating it.
Okay, that's the grand vision. Finally, though, Engels notes something interesting. A peculiar situation in Germany regarding housing, which sets it apart from England and France. What was that, and what are its implications?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating observation, and it speaks to how the specific, diverse paths of industrial and social development in different countries matter. Engels points out that, unlike England or France, in no other country do there exist so many wage workers who own not only their own dwellings, but also a garden or field as well.
So worker-owned smallholdings alongside industrial work.
Yes, exactly. This unusual pattern of rural domestic industry carried on in conjunction with horticulture or small-scale agriculture forms the broad basis of Germany's new large-scale industry, especially in certain regions. In the industrial west of Germany, he says, workers often owned their dwellings. In the east, they were more likely tenants, but often with very secure, long-term possession, almost like a form of hereditary tenancy.
So it wasn't just concentrated urban poverty.
Not entirely, no. This combination of domestic industry, often hand-weaving or similar crafts done at home, combined with small-scale agriculture and relatively secure housing, was widespread, particularly in areas where older forms of production persisted alongside newer factories or where industry established itself as a primarily rural occupation.
And what was the significance of this, according to Engels?
Well, the upside, as he explained it, is that because of this dispersed, semi-rural industrial base, the revolutionary working-class movement in Germany had spread so tremendously over the greater part of the country instead of being confined exclusively to the urban centers.
Making it more widespread.
Exactly. This led, he thought, to steady, certain, and irresistible progress. Unlike in Paris, for example, where revolutionary movements often started and were largely confined to the capital city.
And could be crushed from the outside.
Right. They could then be defeated by reactionary forces coming in from the more conservative provinces, as happened dramatically in 1848 and again with the Paris Commune in 1871. The revolutionary capital was isolated and crushed. But German socialist initiatives, Engels suggests, stemmed from a more decentralized base across both industrial and rural areas with these worker smallholders.
So maybe slower, but harder to stamp out.
That's the implication. It made their progress perhaps slower, maybe less dramatic than Parisian uprisings, but ultimately more resilient and widespread, creating a broader base of support that was harder for the state to suppress completely. It raises a really interesting question for you to consider. How do these different patterns of economic development, like this more decentralized worker ownership model in parts of Germany, influence the actual nature and spread of social movements? Does a more distributed industrial base necessarily lead to a more robust, distributed social change? Or perhaps just a slower, more protracted one?
That's a great question. Wow. Okay. This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive into Frederick Engels' The Housing Question. We've really explored his systematic critique first of Proudhon's appeal to eternal justice, which he saw as, well, fundamentally flawed economically and legally.
Right, a kind of moral wishful thinking detached from economic reality.
And then his critique of the bourgeoisie's philanthropic patchwork solutions, the building societies, the limited state aid, the Haussmann approach, which he argued just shifted problems around or reinforced existing power structures, never really getting to the root cause.
Exactly. We've seen how seemingly benign solutions, things like encouraging worker homeownership or enacting selective urban renewal projects, can, in his analysis, have these underlying motives that ultimately benefit the powerful or simply displace problems rather than solving them.
Right.
Engels compellingly shows, or argues at least, that these practical solutions often aren't truly practical in the long run if they don't tackle the root cause, which, for him, is always the capitalist mode of production itself. It's a powerful reminder that surface-level fixes, no matter how well-intentioned they might seem, rarely achieve deep, lasting change if the underlying system remains intact.
So what does this all mean for us today, over a century and a half later? The housing question, or certainly variations of it, debates about affordable housing, soaring rents, urban gentrification, the challenges of homelessness, it still looms incredibly large in so many societies around the world.
Absolutely. Engels' century-old analysis, whether you agree with his conclusions or not, still resonates in surprising and, frankly, often uncomfortable ways.
It really does.
And this raises, I think, an important question for you, the listener, to ponder, especially as you look at today's news and current social issues. How many of the social problems we grapple with today might also be primarily symptoms of deeper systemic issues, rather than just isolated problems that can be solved with targeted superficial remedies?
That's a challenging thought.
It is. Think about how that Haussmann principle of displacement still plays out in urban development today. Maybe we call it gentrification, pushing lower-income populations out of revitalized areas only for the problem of affordable housing to resurface somewhere else, often worse.
Yeah, you see that constantly.
Or consider how seemingly helpful policies, maybe certain tax breaks or subsidies, might subtly reinforce existing inequalities by failing to address the fundamental economic structures that created those inequalities in the first place. Are we just rearranging the deck chairs?
A truly provocative thought to mull over. One that definitely encourages us to look beyond the immediate symptom and consider the underlying systems at play. We really hope this deep dive has given you a richer, maybe more nuanced understanding of this timeless, complex issue.
And perhaps prompted you to question some of the solutions you encounter in your own world, to ask whether they're addressing the roots or just the surface.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep digging deeper.